So good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Block. I'm the Senior Development and Communications Manager at Brooklyn A. We are really happy that you're all here with us. I want to begin by acknowledging that, I know this has been a really kind of complicated time for a lot of people, and want to thank everyone for what they're doing to maintain stability in your own personal lives, in your families, in your professional lives, and in your communities. So we wanted to hold this event because, as you may know, we last week the Rent Guidelines Board met and they voted on the rent increases as well as a couple of other things. So we wanted to hold this event as a way for tenants throughout New York City to understand what this means for us. And so before we get into the presentation, I just want to go into a quick overview about Brooklyn A and about the services that we offer. So you might be, we might be long-term friends, or maybe you just heard about Brooklyn A through social media, but we're happy that you're all here. Since our founding in Williamsburg, Brownsville, East New York, and Bushwick in 1968, Brooklyn A has used high quality, low barrier, neighborhood-based legal and advocacy tools to disrupt cycles of economic and racial injustice. We represent low and moderate income individuals and families throughout New York City. Our clients live in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods where many residents and small business owners face displacement and illegal landlord harassment. Last year, we served close to 13,000 residential tenants, homeowners, taxpayers, and small business owners through our 3 program areas. And as you can see here, this slide lays out some of the services, or all of the services that we offer. For tenants, we do work in eviction prevention, anti-harassment, and fair housing claims. We help to get repairs made and essential services restored, like heat and hot water. We also do tenant organizing. For taxpayers, we help with any tax issues related to the IRS and to New York State. We help homeowners with deed theft, predatory lending, foreclosure prevention, scam prevention. We recently launched a domestic violence support program where we help people to file orders of protection, also to get child custody and support, as well as other safety planning services for survivors of domestic violence. And then for small businesses and nonprofits, we do commercial lease assistance. We help on rental negotiations, breaches of contract. We help nonprofits and also small, street vendors, workers co-ops to incorporate and to start up services. And we help to advise on compliance and regulatory issues. If you or anyone that you know, your neighbors, your friends, your family, have any needs that we can help out with, please feel free to reach out to us. We can be reached at info@bka.org. I monitor that email address, and so make sure that it gets to the right place, or you can give us a call at 718-487-2300. And we are happy to answer any questions that you have. Before we get into our presentation this evening, I want to give a huge thanks to our sponsors this evening. We have State Senator Julia Salazar, Assemblymember Brian Cunningham, and Council Member Alexa Aviles. Huge supporters and leaders in our community doing so much. And we are really grateful for your partnership and your support. And so we'll hear some remarks from our elected officials, and then we'll move on to our presentation. So Senator Salazar, be happy for you to begin.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. Happy Election Day. I hope that folks have had an opportunity to vote if you're eligible to vote. My name is Julia Salazar. I represent the 18th State Senate District, which includes actually neighborhoods that Sarah mentioned where BK initially served and continues to serve our communities in North and East Brooklyn. But I also, in my capacity as a state senator, I serve on the Senate's Housing Committee. I sponsor a bill called the Good Cause Eviction Bill, which would expand basically tenant protections that rent stabilized tenants currently have in terms of stability, being able to stay in their homes, and limiting rent increases would expand those protections to unregulated renters, people who aren't in the rent stabilized system. And am really just grateful for the work that BKA does for all tenants, regardless of whether they're rent regulated or not. And also the organizing and the education that you all provide, such as this webinar, to make sure that when there are actions taken by the city or the state, in this case by the Rent Guidelines Board, that you're prepared and you know how you're impacted by those decisions. For what it's worth, you know, for my part personally, I vehemently opposed these rent increases. A lot of our neighbors are already unable to afford to pay our rents, and so it really would have been better for us to see either a rent freeze in rent stabilized units or even a rent rollback. But here we are, and we have to just move forward and try our best to do more to protect tenants all over the state in Albany. So you have my commitment to do that, but really grateful for the work that BK is doing. And thank you all for taking the time to make sure that we all know our rights and that people are prepared for what's to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. Really appreciate your commitment to tenants' rights and your partnership with our office. And so next we'll hear from Councilmember Aviles.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. And absolutely good to see you, Senator Salazar. Always appreciate your fight in Albany. And we're going to keep fighting for just cause no matter what. So thank you for all that you do. And thank you, BK, for hosting this important conversation. You know, it is the #1 issue that New Yorkers are facing. And we see, unfortunately, a compounding terrible decision after terrible decision. So I'm Alexa Aviles. I represent District 38 in South Brooklyn, covering the neighborhoods of Sunset Park and Red Hook. I was just going to combine them. You know, the rent is just too damn high for everyone. And honestly, it is the #1 thing we see in our district office. We see seniors who are at the brink of displacement with no good tools. So, you know, I think we're going to continue to fight for relief at the state level for the package of bills, including Good Cause. In this next round, we're not going away. And at the city level, we are in the last days of a budget negotiation, with the mayor having just vetoed a package of 4 bills to help people use vouchers to try to get people into housing stability. You know, the situation really doesn't look good and it's tenuous for us. And, you know, in the budget, I'm of the mindset that, you know, our city can't just say it believes in the affordable housing crisis. It has to invest not only in building, but in preservation and in right to counsel, right? BK knows a lot about all these services. So we need to make sure that we are not cutting, which this administration has done several times over the course of a year, even when the Independent Budget Office says there's surplus. So I'm with many council members here fighting to make sure that our moral document is a moral document, our budget, and we are fully funding not only right to counsel, but capital for HPD to actually build affordable housing. And NYCHA, I'm the chair of public housing at the city council. So there's really a lot at stake, and I just want to thank BK. I could talk all night about it, but y'all know it. And it's really important for our residents to understand where they can get support and what some of these things mean with the rent guidelines board and the implications of stabilized, not stabilized. You know, if you have a voucher and you're getting caught in, you know, with utilities issues, there are a lot of resources for you out here. BK is one of them. And just want to thank you so much for your work, and I look forward to learning more with everyone else today. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Councilmember. You brought up a lot of important issues that we are certainly going to cover and go deeper into. And you have our support as you continue to strengthen protections for tenants and investments. And we really appreciate all the work that you're doing. So we will, well, can we move on to the agenda slide? Thank you. I'm going to now turn it over to Zach Hale and Melissa Giddings in our Preserving Affordable Housing program. They're going to go over the rent guidelines board overview, the results of the June 21st vote, the rent stabilization status, lease renewal process based on rent stabilization status, what's next in this process, what we can expect, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. Please hold your questions to the end of the presentation. Feel free to put them in the chat at any point, but we'll be going over them after the presentation. We'll have some space for questions either written in the chat. We also have the question answer function enabled on the bottom of the Zoom screen, and then you can also choose to speak your question verbally. But we'll go through the presentation and answer them at the end. We'll also send out the presentation to folks afterwards, so don't worry about getting all your notes down. We'll send out a recording, we'll send out a copy of the presentation, so you'll have all the resources moving forward. And I will, Melissa or Zach, sorry, who is starting?
I'll kick things off.
Okay, awesome. And just a heads up, if Assemblymember Cunningham joins, I think we'll just pause quickly and let him speak.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sounds
cool.
great.
Thanks, Zach. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you again to our elected officials who have supported us in so many ways and here tonight. So we'll jump right in, and the first thing that a lot of people may be asking themselves when they hear about the rent increases is, who is it that's increasing the rent, right? And the answer is formally the Rent Guidelines Board. So the Rent Guidelines Board is basically, they are a committee of what's called public servants that are in charge of determining the increases that are allowed for rent stabilized apartments in New York City. So we'll hear more about the exact rent stabilized housing stock, but it's over 1 million units. It's millions of families impacted by these decisions. New York has a unique rent stabilization, rent regulation system. It dates back to 1920. The Rent Guideline Board itself has been around since 1969. And basically it is composed of political appointments made by mayors. So it's not that each mayor appoints all of them, because they have staggered terms. So some of them have a 2-year term, some of them have a 3-year term, and some of them have a 4-year term. So it gets a little bit complicated. You kind of get into some complicated math figuring all that out. But basically they are appointed by the mayor, which gives them a unique flavor based on the mayor that's in charge when the appointment happens. There are always going to be 9 members. 2 of them are supposed to be tenant representatives and are usually selected from the tenant advocacy community. 2 of them are owner representatives, and they're selected from owner interest groups or their selections. And then 4 of them are public members. So these are people with experience in economics, finance, consulting. Currently, I think we have a consultant with government history, a couple of professors, and then we have the chairperson who just does not have a term limit and is actually just serves at the will of the mayor. We can go to the next slide. So what they do is they assess a bunch of research, right? They have a staff. Besides these members, they have a staff that puts together all over the course of the year hundreds of pages of research and presentations based on the housing market and the employment markets and the mortgages and census data. And they put together all of this information. And then that is supposed to contribute to some initial recommendations. And then those recommendations are put out publicly and kick off a series of public hearings that start in the spring and go until the early summer. So during that time, they take in public input. The mayor's office, as we've said, appoints these people. So there's definitely kind of a direct line of input there, but the mayor doesn't weigh in directly in public on these matters. Whereas city council members and state legislatures, such as our sponsors tonight, many of them do get up and speak at the public hearings, make public comments, and engage in advocacy in that way. Citizens also engage in advocacy, and all kinds of constituents, obviously, not only citizens, but just renters and family members, people who come through in the process. And that is possibly a year-long process. We'll talk about that later, but with these public hearings. Ultimately, they do a vote, and we can go to the next slide to kind of see what the votes have looked like. So this is looking back to, the initial votes that they took back in the 60s all the way to now. You can see that it kind of converges. There's a lot of 2% is very common. That seems like a default. Obviously, we've been higher for that this year, which we'll talk about in a moment. And last year have been two of the highest increases in many years. And there have been some rent freezes. And there have even been, so this is the New York City, but there are rent guideline boards in other places. So for example, the Kingston Rent Guideline Board actually did a rent rollback last year. And so these are all created under the same laws, but each one is in charge of its own city. And so there are a lot of possibilities, political possibilities for the outcomes here. We can go to the next slide. And yeah, I guess we're going to talk a little bit about the vote this year now. So I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Melissa, to discuss that.
Okay. I thought you were gonna.
Oh yeah, I'll keep rolling. I'll keep rolling on that. So let's go to the next one. And I'll just go ahead and say that, so we had the official final vote. There was a preliminary vote back in May, and there was a period of public comment. There was the final vote in just last week. It was June 21st. They approved so every rent guidelines approval goes through two different options, right? There's the 1-year lease option and the 2-year lease option. This year, they went and made it even more complicated by splitting the 2-year increase into individual years, which there has been some good reporting we can talk about later in the Q&A about how that came about. That's kind of a compromise that interestingly had the backing of the tenant members of the board rather than the owner members. So what it looks like is, 3% is a 1-year lease increase. That is less than last year, which was 3.25%. But it's still quite high. As we heard our sponsors say earlier, this is, affordability. We're in a total crisis across the city, and 3% is a very large increase. And many families will struggle or not be able to make those payments. The 2-year increase for the first year is less than that. It's 2.75%, but then the second year is 3.2% of that increase. my head already hurts talking about this. What that does, it smooths out to a 4.4% increase over the course of the year. So if people are confused about that, we'll talk more, but basically you're looking at a 3% increase for 1 year and a 4.4% increase for 2 years. Just how you pay that 4.4 is split up. We have a great example here, very basic. If your rent was $1,000 and you did the 2-year, then you would end up paying $1,027.50 for 1 year and then $1,060.38 for the second year. That's a lot of complicated budgeting and accounting for everybody involved. That's just kind of part of this process. So they will go into effect for leases that start after October 1st of this year, and then will stop at September 30th of the next year. But of course, if you pick a 2-year lease, then that will take you into 2025. And we can do more on the Q&A on this, but you know, people try to think about individual decisions about which 1 year or 2 year to select. A highly personal decision, but I can field questions on some considerations there later. And I'll pass it over to Melissa to talk about the types of tenancies in general across the city.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, so I'm going to get into a little bit of the distinctions, the differences in types of tenancies that we see in New York City, and then what the renewal and rent increase process looks like based on your tenancy. So the majority of New Yorkers, as I'm sure will come to no surprise, rent as opposed to own. And when you look at the breakdown of renters, there's actually nearly half of renters live in rent stabilized units or units that should be rent stabilized. The rest of it is private, unregulated units. This will often be in houses with less than 5 units or units that have been lawfully deregulated. There's a shrinking supply of rent controlled units that will generally become stabilized once the final rent controlled tenant vacates permanently. There's public housing, that'll be your NYCHA housing, Section 8 housing, and then there are other regulated rentals, which is generally Mitchell-Lama apartments, loft board regulated apartments and the like. But yeah, you have about over 1 million apartments that should be rent stabilized. So this is definitely a relevant vote for many, many of our neighbors. So the question, should you be rent stabilized? Hopefully your landlord is giving you the appropriate lease that would indicate that you are a rent stabilized tenant in the first instance. And then every renewal lease that you have after as well should explicitly say that this is a rent stabilized lease or a renewal lease. If you have an inclination that you should be stabilized and you're not getting those leases, there's a few questions to ask yourself. If these apply to you, does your apartment have 6 or more units? Was your building built and occupied before 1974? Is your landlord a person or a business, i.e. not an NYCHA apartment? And if your building was built after 1974, if it's one of the newer buildings, does it take advantage of the different tax incentives that landlords can receive, like the J51 or 421A abatements, and in exchange for landlords receiving those incentives, they have to have stabilized units as well. So if you're answering yes to those questions, then you may be stabilized. And now we're going to go over how you can actually look into that. So the best way to find out, the only way to find out if you're officially stabilized actually, is to go through the DHCR process. That's the Division of Homes and Community Renewal. That's a city body. If you go to that address at the top, or if you search DHCR, am I rent stabilized in Google, it'll take you to this portal. Now in this portal, you go to it, it asks you the reason why you're submitting an inquiry. We would recommend that you do both the am I rent stabilized inquiry and the apartment rent history inquiry. Both of these will result in DHCR either reaching out to the email you provide or more likely sending you your rent history in a physical copy to the address that you provide. So this is done because generally the tenant living there is the person that's allowed to request the history. So that's why if you're requesting the rent history for your apartment, it's going to get sent to your apartment, and it'll come in a fairly innocuous white envelope that's from DHCR. When you open that, you'll see a history that will indicate if your unit's stabilized. It will indicate how high the increase has been over the history of the unit's years. And it'll essentially flag whether or not there's been funny business going on. Now, the next slide, there's another portal. Who owns what .justfix.org. This is actually a great resource for a number of things. I recommend that any tenant uses this resource to find out more about their building. This resource will show you links on the bottom where you see that red arrow pointing to. So that the relevant for the tax incentives, because you might not know if your building has the J51 or 421A abatements that would qualify you for rent stabilization status. If you click on that Department of Finance property tax link or the ANHD DAP portal link, those will generally indicate to you whether or not your building received those incentives. But those other useful links there, the ACRIS link will pull up the property documents, deeds, etc. The HPD building profile will tell you about violations on your building and whether or not certain code violations have yet to be addressed by your landlord. It'll tell you about different repair issues that your neighbors are experiencing as well. Generally, highly useful information for a tenant to have. But specifically with regards to finding out if your rent stabilized, those links will help you look up the different tax exemptions if you don't already know that answer. So now we'll go over what the lease renewal process looks like for different types of tenants. Starting, of course, with stabilized tenants. So, as Zach discussed, the Rent Guidelines Board sets the maximum increase that a stabilized tenant can receive when they're renewing their lease. If you're a stabilized tenant, you are entitled to receive written notice about the renewal at least 90 days before your renewal date. So at least about 3 months out, you should be receiving, like the latest, about 3 months out latest, you should be receiving notice from your landlord about renewing your lease. If you're a rent stabilized tenant, you have a right to a lease renewal. You're entitled to it. You can choose to renew for 1 to 2 years. And then you will need to let your landlord know your choice within 60 days of you receiving the renewal form. As an aside, if a tenant resides in a rent stabilized or controlled apartment and you receive the senior citizen rent increase exemption or the disability rent increase exemption, the rental portion is frozen. So even though the landlord can take an increase every year in order to continue to increase the unit's rent, the tenant portion that you pay year over year would be frozen. So if you receive those exemptions and you're noticing that they're alleging in their lease that they're going to be charging you more, that's something to flag in order to get a lease that appropriately takes the increase. We actually have a visual aid on the next slide to show you what the renewal lease form will look like for stabilized tenants. This is a standardized form. This is what it should look like to you. This is a great indicator that you are in fact a stabilized tenant. As you see on the top, it says that the lease is subject to the rent stabilization code, and it standardizes the math essentially. So if you look under the offer to tenant to renew, you should see your current rent in column B. Column C would be doing the math on what the increase is. So this is where you'll see the 3% for 1 year. The column might look a little bit different because we have that strange compounded increase that would be, you know, the 2.75 the first year and 3.2 the next year. But those are the numbers you should be seeing in column 3, depending on whether or not you're renewing for 1 or 2 years. The landlord should be putting both of those numbers and all of that math in front of you on your renewal lease, because it is up to you to choose which rate you want to agree to. Column D and column E will only really come into play if your unit or if your building has had individual apartment improvements or major capital improvements, and those would be agreed upon and like known increases. So if there's something wonky there, then you of course should follow up with your landlord and ask for an explanation on that. And not only are you entitled as a rent stabilized tenant to a renewal lease, but you're entitled to a renewal lease on the same terms and conditions as your original lease. And that's an important thing to know. If there's a new term in there, if the landlord is suddenly saying that they're not going to pay for heat and it did last year, that's not allowed. You should absolutely flag that and ask for a lease that's on the same terms and conditions as the very first lease that you signed. And actually the next slide talks about your options if you are not receiving the right lease. So if you're a stabilized tenant and your landlord is charging you above the rates that were set by the Rent Guidelines Board, if they're not offering you enough time to consider your renewal, or if they're offering you, you know, some other unlawful lease, like the terms and conditions that we just discussed, you have the ability to go to DHCR and file a complaint asking for a lawful lease and trying to compel your landlord to get that lawful lease. I'm mentioning this briefly now, but we will circle back to it toward the end of this presentation near the questions time, and Zach will go a little bit more into detail about what that process looks like. Okay, and then I do briefly want to touch on in the next couple slides the renewal process if you're not stabilized, because even though if you're an unregulated tenant, your landlord can technically raise your rent by their whims, unfortunately. However, tenants that are unregulated do still have notice protections. So if your landlord is trying to increase your rent by greater than 5%, you are entitled to receive notice either 30, 60, or 90 days in advance, depending on the length of your tenancy. If you don't receive that notice, they can't take that increase until 30, 60, or 90 days after they do formally give you that notice in writing. So know that the law says that it has to be written notice. You should also check your lease to see if there's a specified provision in your lease that says they have to serve you with that notice, or they have to mail that notice to you in a specific way. They have to follow both the law and the lease that you agreed to. These notice requirements also apply to if the landlord is not renewing your lease. So if for whatever reason they're not going to renew your lease, they still have to give you 30, 60, or 90 days, depending on the length of your tenancy notice. And if they don't give you that notice, they can't legally evict you. Okay, then we'll go to the next slide. Rent controlled tenants, just this is, again, as you saw, there's like 20,000 rent controlled units left. So this is not really going to apply to too many of us, unfortunately, but it's essentially all you need to know is that you're not obligated to sign a renewal lease in order for your lease to be renewed. But just that the amount of increases are limited. And they have to be determined by DHCR as well. Public housing tenants, your lease, it's the same way, but you know, if you're an NYCHA tenant, you have to recertify your income annually because your rent is generally pegged to 30% of your household income. And that happens on an annual basis, and your renewal should reflect that proper amount as well. And if it doesn't, then that's again something that you should flag on an annual basis to make sure that you aren't paying more than you should be, essentially. Okay. And then I'm gonna actually turn it back over to Zach so he can tell you what you should be doing and what you should be thinking about doing as next steps in this process to tenant.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. So these are just some, again, this is not, personalized legal advice. These are kind of generic next steps for those of you who, I assume if you're on this call, you're interested, not just in knowing, what the situation is right now, but what can change, right? Both for you and across the city. So one of the important steps that we recommend to everybody, is get your rent history from DHCR. As Melissa pointed out, the portal there, or you can go through the Just Fix website. They also have a tool. Get that rent history, and that was going to provide some possible clues about what, if you are stabilized and you're stabilized, that might give you a clue about if your rent is correct currently. If you're not sure if you are stabilized, it could give you hints about that. And it's difficult to interpret, and there's not a clear, bold headline saying, here is the rent stabilization status. So you can take that, you can reach out to Brooklyn A to connect with one of our attorneys to kind of, go through that with you. And that's a good first step. Also, if you are rent stabilized, you could be eligible for rent reductions based on conditions in your apartment, or what they call reductions of services. So, you could, that DHCR portal that Melissa was pointing out before, you can apply. For example, let's say that there is an elevator in your building and that elevator is not working. You can file with DHCR online. You can do it from your phone, or you can submit paperwork, and they will come out and look at the elevator. And if it's not working, then they will put a rent reduction on all of the affected units. And what that means is your rent will be rolled back to the last increase and then frozen until things are fixed. Now, this is a very time intensive process sometimes. I've seen it take almost a year for inspectors to even come. So that's, it's not exactly a quick turnaround, but I strongly encourage people, reach out to us again at BKA, or, if you are comfortable just using some internet research and looking it up, DHCR makes the forms available online. You're also possibly eligible for other types of freezes depending on your status in your other situations that may be going on in your life or with your family. So definitely you want to look into that. For example, there are, SCREE for senior citizens, as we talked about, DREE for people with disabilities. One of the most important things you can do that's related to all of this is talk to your neighbors, right? So if you have issues in your apartment, chances are they may have issues in their apartment as well. If your apartment is rent stabilized, and you notice, and you've been there for a long time, and you notice some new people coming in, maybe you saw the listing online that it was, way more rent than what you're paying, that might be an indicator that they are moving into an illegally deregulated apartment. So talk to your neighbors, let them know, because that solidarity, that working together, that can bring everybody's rents down, right? I mean, you can bring the rents down across the building, like I just talked about. And you can also just form the basis for working together in other ways to ensure that your community is safe and feels like a place where you can, interact with each other, share both the triumphs and the challenges. In terms of the Rent Guideline Board process itself, it's over for now, but it formally gets started again in terms of the public hearings and the public reports in March of 2024. So be on the lookout for that. We will be on our social media. Brooklyn A will be talking about, when there are public hearings, sharing information about that. So make sure to follow us there on Twitter, on Facebook, and we will be providing updates for that. Also, you can, and you can look this up online, but you can call, they do have a year-round staff. So you can call and put input into the Rent Guideline Board staff over the course of the year. That isn't the most direct way of getting to the board members, but it is an option for feedback as well. So those are kind of the headlines. We have 15 minutes left, and I think Sarah and Will are going to coordinate some Q&A now, and we'll get whatever we don't get to, follow up with Brooklyn A. We'd love to continue the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Zach. That was really informative. And we hope that you all, just feel more informed, more prepared. And certainly what Zach said, please share this information with your neighbors. That's really, really important to keep kind of our whole community safe. So we'll open it up to questions. Again, you can put your questions into the chat or into the question and answer section. I see a few questions already in the question and answer sections. Awesome. We will get to those. Also, if you would like to ask your question verbally, you can go down to the bottom of your screen, click the participants tab, click that little hand button next to your name, and we can call on you to answer. And unfortunately, I have to jump off, but Will will be moderating our question and answer. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to, again, to our elected officials for sponsoring this event. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And yes, thank you again, Zach and Melissa, and of course, to our elected officials for joining us. So we do have a couple in written now, and I see one hand up. Why don't we start going back to the 2-year leases? I know those that was a little confusing. The question here, unless my math is incorrect, I can understand for a 2-year lease, 2.75 first year plus 3.2 second year is a total of 4.5. Zach, you want to go back into the details there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see also that the council member of ELS is signing off. So thank you again to her. So it is confusing. The math is confusing. It's like 4.39%, I think, is what it ends up being. Because you have to look at, so it's 2.75%. The math is confusing is the easy answer to that. But it's like 2.75% for the first year, and then the 3.2% of the 2.75% for the second year. But if you add up each of those for 24 months, and then you divide it to average it out, that's where that 4.4% comes from. So 4.4 is like the ultimate at the end of 2 years pocketbook, what comes home charge, but it's phased out. So I can see.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure.
I can see the other written questions, but we can also talk.
Yeah, I just see a hand up, so I just want to give them a chance.
Go over there.
This looks like Gabrielle. I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to unmute yourself. Gabrielle or Gabriel, maybe not Dominique last name. You are able to unmute. We've got you in the room here if you want to ask your question. Okay, might be away from the screen. So yeah, why don't we go back to the written questions from Harrison Henry there. Zach, you see it there?
Yeah, so we've got two. I got one that's maybe a little bit more rhetorical, political question, which I completely get this question. Harrison, the mayor appoints the 2 members. I will give this caveat though. The tenant members that are on there currently are, I think, strong tenant advocates. I mean, these are people with long-standing records of fighting for tenants. We've got a tenant attorney with legal aid, and we've got Genesis Aquino, who's the head of a great tenant advocacy organization. So that, but as you said, it's the mayor that picks these things. So the way it goes, Bill de Blasio picked Edan Soltran, one of them, and he's still in his term. And then Eric Adams picked Genesis Aquino. So you have that overlapping too. And so whoever is elected mayor in the next cycle will appoint one, and that will overlap. And so it does get a little gray, but at the end of the day, yes, these are mayor appointees. The other question from Harrison about the DHCR rent history, just to address that, I or another attorney would have to look at it specifically to evaluate what that means. In general, the phrase concession can mean a couple of things, but it usually means that the landlord at that point made some agreement to give like a temporary reduction of rent, and usually that's documented somehow. And so that can be used very legitimately, and it can also be manipulated. So it's hard to know just from the record. I see we have hands again, so.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zach. I'm typing as best I can, summing up your answers, just to reply to the written ones there. Feel free to make any edits you want. I see James Gaynor. I'm going to bring it into the room, James, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, James. That's a client we work with.
James, can you hear it? We can't hear you yet. I see you're unmuted, but we still can't hear you. Do you have like headphones plugged in maybe? James, you there?
We're having an issue.
Yeah, might have an issue. James, if you want to type your question, we'd be happy to answer it. We're just having trouble hearing you. I'll leave it open for just a couple more seconds here, but yeah, please, at the bottom of your screen, everybody, you can see there's the Q&A chat basically, and you can type your question into there. If anybody has other questions, please type them, or if you want to raise your hand again, maybe we'll try Gabriella one more time. But in between that, Zach and Melissa, just even for me, could you just hammer home the difference, the stabilized units and controlled units, that those are different, right? Those aren't synonymous.
Right. Melissa, you talked a little bit about that. Do you want to?
Sure. I mean, controlled is what you think of when you think of like the magic tenancy in New York City, rent controlled units, because the rent is so it's been low. These units have been in existence for decades. Usually the tenants have lived there, lifelong tenants or tenants that have appropriately succeeded them before the law changed, but they are a diminishing supply. Like there won't, unless there's some sort of change in statute, there won't be new rent controlled units created, and rent controlled units will be lost and converted to stabilized, usually if the tenant that's currently in the building right now vacates. And that's either if they move or if they pass away. And then stabilized is what you see the majority of the time. And that's where the tenancies are subject to annual maximum increases like the rent guidelines board sets. They also are entitled to renewal leases in very, very few limited exceptions for a landlord being able to evict a stabilized tenant. They have to make out a legal claim for the tenant being a nuisance, or they can bring a non-payment eviction proceeding if the tenant's not paying their rent. Again, very limited exception. What our representatives were talking about at the beginning of this meeting, when they were talking about pushing forward a bill for a good cause eviction, would create that same entitlement for unregulated tenants, for every tenant in New York City. There would have to be some sort of cause rather than a landlord just not feeling like renewing your tenancy. So if you see things around good cause eviction, what that would be doing would be creating that same entitlement that stabilized tenants currently do have.
Gotcha. Very helpful. Thank you. Let's again, if other folks have questions, please do either raise your hand or type them into the chat. Let's give our raised hands another shot. Gabriel Dominique, will invite you to the room again if you want to unmute if you're at your screen. Feel free to. Okay, might have moved away. And James, why don't we'll give one more try, see if maybe the mic is working. Now, can you hear us, James? I see you unmuted. I'm not hearing you on my end. Zach or Melissa, can you guys hear? No. James, if you have like headphones or something plugged in, sometimes maybe that's the headphone is the issue. If you want to try unplugging and just speaking into the speaker. Dude, still not coming through. All right, well, if you see at the bottom, James, of your screen, there it says Q&A, and if you open that window up, you should be able to type your question in. So sorry that we're still not able to hear you. I'll leave your mic open, but we do have another question typed into the chat. A few years ago, my building had a rollback of our rent, and we received a rent reduction order that should still be in effect, but we subsequently went on a rent strike for more than 2 years. Maybe more of a story, but yeah, go ahead, Zach.
I can hop right in, and whoever is typing that, if you want to add more, you can type more or raise your hand. So, the rent reduction overlap with the rent strike. There's not really a direct interaction there. So to get the rent reduction order lifted, the landlord has to make the repairs, presumably, right? Do whatever it is that was the issue, address that. And then they have to get DHCR to come out and clear the order. And then they do what's called a rent restoration order. So there has to be a whole process. Everyone in the building should get notified that the landlord has applied to restore the rent. There's an opportunity to comment on that. And if you contest it and say they actually hadn't made the repairs, DHCR has to come out and look. They make a determination. So this whole process takes months to lift it. There should be notice to everyone involved. So that's kind of the situation with the rollback. When you go on the rent strike, which is a separate situation, often used to try to get repairs, then the rent strike can be a method of getting your rent abated. Now, this is where those two things do interact, right? When you're in court with a rent strike, if you're saying that you want your rent to get reduced for the same issues that are the issue in the rent reduction order, then the court will not. I see. Okay, so the landlord was denied. Okay, so in this situation, so let's use an example of the broken elevator again, right? So let's say that you had the broken elevator, and so everyone in the building that put their name on the form gets a rent reduction for the elevator. Now, if you did a rent strike also about the elevator, and you went to court and you asked the court to reduce your rent that you owe because of the elevator, the court will not do that because your rent has already been reduced by DHCR for that issue. But if there are other issues that you're bringing up that aren't subject to that, that's when you can still get the rent reduced. So if there were also like mold and other things, then you can still argue for it to be reduced. So they overlap just in that one case where if you go to court and you're asking for your rent to be reduced for the same condition as the order. So I know that's a little confusing, but that's where they intersect.
Thank you, Zach. Those questions came in anonymously, so that might have been James. James, and sadly, we still can't hear you. But if you have a specific question, or if anybody has a specific question, you can reach out to us directly. Again, our contact info is the email is info@bka.org. And our phone number is 718-487-2300. And I'll put that info into the chat right now. And just last call, if there are any other questions that people want to type. Yeah, Zach, go ahead.
So I want to add just one thing in this context, and it was referenced earlier, but there's another way, two other ways that your rent could be increased that's not related to the rent guideline board. And that has to do with improvements that may be being made in your apartment or in the building. So for those, the landlord has to apply and go through a process and get approved to get the rent increase. So that's another situation where DHCR should be giving you notices. So if you all of a sudden, if your landlord says, I put in a new security system, so I'm going to charge you an extra $20 a month for that security system, that is not legal. They have to go through the DHCR and get the official state agency to approve that increase. That approval process allows for you to say they never really installed the security system or it doesn't work, to try to combat that. Ultimately, if they actually did make an approved improvement, then they can raise the rent on you. So that is, another way that things can be increased. If there are other conditions in the building that led to a rent freeze, then they can't do an increase during that time. So again, your head could be spinning easily with all this stuff. I know mine does. So if you're in a situation, you have questions, reach out to us at the contact information that we'll put in the chat. And thank you to everybody for coming.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Melissa. Everybody, we will have the full program from tonight posted online on our YouTube channel. You can see it. We'll promote it on our social media, and we'll send it out in an email blast, and we'll make sure that everyone here gets added to our email list. So you'll be able to receive that. And again, as Zach said, please do reach out to us if you have other specific questions. And otherwise, we really thank everybody for being here. Thank you again to our elected official sponsors. And we hope everybody has a good night. Thanks all.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everybody.
Everybody.